Oh, I'm surprised y'all aren't talking about it in world history at least. Well, but there's a lot going on in the world today, and much of what we see in the world today we can trace back to a system called colonization. My lecture title simply today is The Necessity of Decolonization. So let's go ahead and get started and let's deal with the subject just as it's before us. Decolonization, the action or process of a state withdrawing from a former colony. Let me read that again. The action or process of a state withdrawing from a former colony. So when we say decolonization, we're saying a people, a state that was once colonized is no longer colonized. They've withdrawn themselves from it. They've separated themselves from it, leaving it independent. So when you decolonize, you're independent. You are no longer dependent upon another government to care for you. You're no longer dependent upon another government to govern you. You're self-governing. So when we say decolonization, we're talking about the free will of the people to actually govern themselves. Now, let's keep rolling. Decolonization, American English, or decolonization, spelled two different ways, same thing, is the undoing of colonialism. So when you decolonize, Tony, you are undoing colonialism. We'll talk about colonialism in a minute, but you're undoing something. So decolonization is when another group of people impose their will politically, spiritually, religiously, educationally, economically on another group. So it's natural for everybody to want to decolonize. Stefan, your classmates should not be controlling you. Tony, your classmates should not be controlling you. If they're controlling you, they have colonized you in their own right. The only people that should be controlling you is you, and then your parents, of course. Now, it says, is the undoing of colonialism, the latter being the process whereby a nation establishes and maintains its domination on overseas territories. The concept particularly applies to the dismantlement during the second half of the 20th century of the colonial empires established prior to World War I throughout the world. So colonial empires were established throughout the world. This system of colonization was a global system. A lot of people try to localize it. It was a global system. It was a system of domination that was to occur throughout the entire world. The colonizers would go into foreign countries and foreign territories and take over those territories. We'll talk about it some more in a second. But what I want you to understand, most importantly, when you decolonize, you separate yourself from it. When you decolonize, you're no longer under the authority or control of your ruler. When you decolonize, you are the actual ruler of your own desires, the actual ruler of your own domain, your own empire. You are the head when you decolonize. Now, don't just think of decolonization as an individual or group of individuals controlling you. Do you know that you can colonize yourself? Do you know that colonization is not just dependent upon somebody else controlling you? But colonization is also when you allow foreign substances and entities to control you. Alcoholism is a form of colonization. Anything that you worship is your colonizer. So the important thing is not to be colonized by anything outside of the righteous spirit that dwells on the inside of you. That's who we want our colonizer to be. Now, watch this. But don't miss this point. Anything that you allow to come in your system that controls you is also your colonizer. And what we're looking to do is decolonize ourselves, because all of us have been colonized. The fundamental right to self-determination is identified by the United Nations as core to decolonization. Now stop. Now check this language out. And I want y'all to get this. And if you have any questions, let's just dialogue. the fundamental right to self-determination is identified by the United Nations as core to decolonization, allowing not only independence but also other ways of decolonization. Look, decolonization is a fundamental right. It's something that we all have the right to do. But one of the most fearful things is when you don't realize you've been colonized. Look at it. The United Nations Special Committee on Decolonization has stated that in the process of decolonization, there is no alternative to the colonizer but to allow a process of self-determination. So, Stefan, when we say decolonization, we're talking about a natural phenomenon, a natural process of self-determination. You should want to be the ruler of your own house. You should want to be the ruler of your own temple. You should not want anybody else to rule your temple outside of you. So when you say decolonization, you're saying self-determination. You're saying that you're parting from the ways of your ruler, of your controller. And anything that has you doing things that's outside of your natural existence is your colonizer. But do you know that the biggest fear of all of this is that you yourself is a colonizer? And you allow foreign entities to come into your very own system to colonize you? But I want you to understand those points, but we're going to deal with colonization on a broader scope. From a broader perspective. Now, watch this. If I smoke cigarettes every single day, if I become addicted to cigarettes, who's my colonizer? Cigarettes. If I drink wine every single day, who's my colonizer? The wine. But back up, son. It's not the cigarettes. It's not the wine. Who is it? You. Because you're bringing it into your existence. You're bringing it into your own system. You are colonizing yourself. And this is a big mistake that we have made. Self-colonization is the worst form of colonization. Self-colonization does not allow for self-determination in the proper context. You have self-determination, but it's self-determination that's causing your very own demise. Do y'all understand what I'm saying? You got me, Stefan? Okay, good. Now watch this. It says, the fundamental right of self-determination is identified by the United Nations as core to decolonization, allowing not only independence, but also other ways of decolonization. The United Nations Special Committee on Decolonization has stated that in the process of decolonization, there is no alternative to the colonizer, but to allow a process of self-determination. In other words, the United Nations is saying the only way you can have freedom, the only way you can have liberty is through self-determination. As long as your colonizer is ruling over you, you do not have self-determination. Self-determination continues to be claimed. Also within independent states to demand decolonization as the case of the indigenous peoples. See, when America came into when the Europeans came into the United States of America, they colonized the Native American. Then, after they colonized the Native Americans, they told the Native Americans they could have self-determination, but on reservations. Now watch this. Let me show you how this works. So you have the Native American. I'm going to put I. And before anybody came here, the Native Americans saw things from this perspective. Very broad. Very broad. He saw from a very broad perspective. As the European invaders came in, his scope became more and more narrow. Look at this. More and more condensed. More and more refined. So after a minute, the Native American was limited to almost no control. He was limited to almost no scope because now he's restricted to reservations. So when you look at it from this perspective, right here, this is the current Native American, except he's probably circled like this. This is the environment that he's in. He's in this restricted environment now. There was a point in time when his environment was this broad. He had no restrictions. Now he's been restricted because his colonizer has separated him on the reservations, isolated him to the reservations. The fear of this is that we're all products of what? You're products of what? Your environment. So but look at the Native American's environment now. You see how restricted it is? His scope and his vision is restricted because as the indigenous people here in the United States of America, they lost it when they became colonized. So their colonizer restricted them to practically nothing. This is more psychological than anything, which we'll talk about in a minute. During the decades of imperialism, the industrializing powers of Europe viewed the African and Asian continents as reservoirs of raw materials. In other words, they looked at Africa and Asia, the European nations, and saw how resourcefully rich they were. And when they saw how resourcefully rich they were determined to go in and take control of their resources. So what I'm telling you, part of colonization is to restrict and take your natural resources from you. Labor and territory for future settlement. So not only did the colonizer see Africa and Asia as labor for future settlements and natural resources, but they saw an opportunity to enslave a people to continue to make Europe rich, to continue to make Europe wealthy. So we can look at it. Colonization, as we understand it, is an imprisonment system where the people that are imprisoning you steal your natural resources, build their natural wealth up, and continue to refine you to the point that the Native American has been refined. Complete restriction. They don't even have their own natural resources anymore. The Native American says this. This is a part of their stories that have been passed down over the years. Before the European came into the United States of America, they could go to any lake and drink fresh water, any river and drink water without contamination. But now every river in the country is contaminated. It says, the territory, let me start back from the point. In most cases, however, significant development and European settlement in these colonies was sporadic. However, the colonies were exploited, sometimes brutally, for natural and labor resources, and sometimes even for military conscripts. Now, brutality was involved in the process. So in order for you to exploit and colonize a people, one of the first things you have to do is destroy the men. Once you destroy the men, then colonization is easy. But first you have to destroy the men. Not just physically, but that's a very important part of colonization. When they destroy you, when they limit you to what you're able to do, when they strip your manhood away, that is a form of colonization that allows them to move within your territory with ease. However, the colonies were exploited, sometimes brutally, for natural and labor resources, and sometimes even for military conscripts. In addition, the introduction of colonial rule drew arbitrary natural borders, that means randomly, where none had ever existed before. When you look at it, see, the Native American, he didn't have natural borders, you see, until now. You restricted him. But before you restricted him, all of this was wide open. Before you restricted him, he had no natural borders. His borders were actually the entire world. These were his borders. He had no real restriction. But now it says, again, it says that in addition, the introduction of colonial rule drew arbitrary natural boundaries where none had existed before, dividing ethnic and linguistic groups and natural features, and laying the foundation for the creation of numerous states lacking geographic and linguistic, ethnic, or political affinity. So, you take away an individual's natural ability to be free when you come and you colonize their territory. And this is what has happened all across the world. But the worst form of colonization, I will say again, is self-colonization. It is the worst form of colonization. But what we see on a global scale is colonization, which is usually being posed by higher-powered nations. Typically, European nations are guilty of colonization, although we saw some of it with Japan and Korea. We saw some of it with China and colonizing its own territories. We saw some of it. Now, watch this. The Romans conquered Jerusalem in 63 BCE. This brought the region under Roman control though they used leaders to govern. The most famous was a ruthless military commander named Herod the Great, 37 through 4 BCE. Herod transformed the country. So what we see is Jerusalem being ruled by the Romans. Once the Romans started to rule Jerusalem, the Romans brought in their own ideology of religion. And they stripped Jerusalem from their natural religion. It's easy to conquer a man once you take his spiritual system away from him and make him dependent upon a system that's yours. So we see now this happening in Jerusalem, which brings us right through the Bible. Josephus claims that 1.1 million people were killed during the siege, of which the majority were Jewish. Josephus attributes this to the celebration of the Passover, which he uses as rationale for the vast number of people present among the death toll. Armed rebels as well as the frail citizens were put to death. All of Jerusalem's remaining citizens became Roman prisoners. All of Jerusalem's remaining citizens became Roman prisoners. All that they didn't kill, they imprisoned. So part of the colonization process is to imprison. And you can rest assured that these prisoners were men. So when you look at during that time, 97,000 men in prison, how can they defend their territory? They can't. Now once you do that, your conqueror is at liberty to do his will, whatever he wants between your women and your children. He can do whatever he wants to do. And the biggest threat to the world today is decolonization. Because world powers who were interested in colonizing fear the rise of decolonization. And we're seeing it all across the globe today. But you know what we're seeing it less? Amongst black people. We're seeing it less amongst black people. That has to change. We can no longer support our colonizers. Stefan, we can no longer be self-colonized. And we're self-colonized when the oppressor is no longer in our presence, but we're doing things that cause us to serve the best interests of the oppressor. Do you understand what I'm saying? When the oppressor is no longer present, but yet through self-colonization, you are doing things to destroy your own existence, making you complicit in the demise of your own community. When you're doing things that causes your own demise and your oppressor is not forcing you to do it, That's the worst form of colonization the world can dream of. If your enemy don't have to fire any weapons, if your enemy no longer has to indoctrinate you, if your enemy no longer has to create war within your own community because you're doing it yourself, that is self-colonization. It is the worst form of colonization that the world has ever seen. You imprison yourself at your own expense. And the colonizer, your oppressor, he's not guilty anymore. Because now you are the guilty. But what I want you to understand is that it is your environment that's making you guilty. Because what's not seen is who restricted you. Who caused you to fall under the rule of self-colonization? From a destructive perspective, what happened that caused you to be that way? Why do we seek to destroy ourselves and our own people? Why? Because we've been self-colonized. But now we have to decolonize. We have to decolonize. And the way you decolonize is how? How do you decolonize? Generally. Son? How do you decolonize? Yes, you do. Because you know what it is to be colonized. If you know what it is to be colonized, then you understand how to decolonize. How do you decolonize, Stefan? Through self-determination. Through self-determination. Let's go back to the definition given to us by the United Nations. The fundamental right to self-determination is identified by the United Nations as core to decolonization. Self-determination, being in control of your own government. But not just self-determination, but self-determination from a righteous perspective. We need righteous decolonization. Your self-determination is what has caused the self-colonization. And as long as you are practicing self-colonization, your self-determination doesn't really exist. Let's keep walking. Y'all all right? Now, so everybody that they couldn't kill, they imprisoned. This is a serious part of colonization. So all of the Jerusalem's remaining citizens, men, became Roman prisoners. After the Romans killed the armed and elder people, 97,000 were enslaved, including Simon Bar Giria, John of Gascala, Simon Bar Giria, and John of Gascala, was sentenced to life imprisonment. Some of these men were imprisoned for life. Those under 17 years of age were sold into servitude. So the ones that they didn't imprison, they sold them into servitude. Usually this would be men, rarely women, that this was happening to. Because they wanted to use the women to continue to exploit. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So it used to be that in that region that I'm talking about, which is North Africa, those people were very dark people, right? The Romans were European. They were white. They were very light in complexion. When you look in that region now, you see a mixed race people. The people are lighter in the northern region because the women were there. And the Romans came in and went into the women and produced a lighter offspring. And typically with colonization, you rule based upon race. And part of your race restriction is complexion. So they allowed the lighter skin to rule over the dark, creating more conflict, pushing the dark further south. Do y'all follow what I'm saying? You got me, Tony? So now in that area of North Africa, you have a lighter complected person. Whereby historically the people in that region were darker complected. And so they used the lighter to rule over the darker, creating greater division. This is what colonization does. But it's very important that we look towards self-determination from a righteous perspective. Self-colonization is only dangerous when you're destroying yourself as a result of self-colonization. Your conqueror becomes your colonizer. Who's your conqueror? Think now. Who's your conqueror, son? You are. Beautiful. You are your conqueror. Look at the language now. Your conqueror becomes your colonizer. Your conqueror is your ruler, your leader, your God. Who is your leader?
Yes, sir.
You. Who is your ruler?
Yes, sir.
Who is your God? Accept that. You are. This is very important that you get this. Now, that is ideally speaking. But the reality is that there's another conqueror that moved in. And he's not self. There's another conqueror that has moved in and that is colonizing you. Let's go with the flow. Your conqueror becomes your colonizer. A country that sends settlers to a place and establishes political control over it. Look at it. A country that sends settlers to a place and establishes political control over it. That's what happened in the United States of America. The Europeans were sent here and they established self-control over what we now call the United States of America. They imposed their will, so therefore they were the colonizers. A person who settles among the established, a person who settles among and establishes political control over the indigenous people of an area. That's what colonizing is. When you allow somebody else to come in and establishes political control over you. This is undoubtedly what has happened to us as a people. We have been colonized, which leads to self-colonization. Now, to colonize is to settle in and take control of land outside your own borders. So when we say we're colonizing, we're not just talking about the conditioning of the mind. We're talking about taking control of your land, taking control of your resources. But in order for those things to happen, self-colonization must happen first. So the colonizer who takes control over your land has to indoctrinate you in such a way that you allow it with little to no resistance. By resistance, what do we mean? When you don't put up any resistance, you're not what? You're not fighting back. So in order for him to get you to that state, he had to indoctrinate you with some things, with some elements that weakens and decreases your ability to fight back. You no longer have the desire to want to fight back because he's trained you to side with him. And once he's trained you to side with him, you are self-colonizing. And once you're self-colonizing, the broader aspect of colonization can easily occur. What do I mean? Once you colonize yourself, you colonize your household. You colonize your community. You colonize your state. You colonize your nation. This is what happens through self-colonization. The worst form of colonization. But in order for you to be colonized, first the oppressor has to come in and indoctrinate you. And once he indoctrinates you with certain elements, then you naturally go out without thinking about it. And you colonize your entire community. Everything that you are involved with, you colonize it. You colonize your own school system. If you're a coach, you colonize the thinking of the children you're coaching. If you're in business, you colonize those you do business with. colonization is the worst form of colonization. This is why we must decolonize. To colonize is to settle and take control of land outside of your own business. Usually a large, powerful country colonizes a territory or areas that's much less powerful. Much less powerful. Now, listen at the language. To colonize is to settle in and take control of land outside of your own borders. So when the Europeans came here, one of the first things they had to do once they indoctrinated the Native American is take control of the land. So you got the Land Act of 1626 and the Land Act of 1785, which gave the European right to claim land at no cost. And when he claimed the land at no cost, he was also able to use slaves to work the land, to build wealth, to further colonize the Native American and the African here. This is what happened. But in order for him to do that, first we have to practice self-colonization. And once he indoctrinates you with his understanding, his will, his spiritual system, it's natural for you to practice self-colonization. And when you start practicing self-colonization, those that are around you have no hope anymore because you colonize them. Are you following what I'm saying? Powerful country, colonies, territory, or area that are much less powerful. To colonize is to settle in and take control of land outside your own borders. Usually a large, powerful country colonizes a territory or area that's much less powerful. Let's go a little bit further. So in the Bible, to show you how this thing works, once the ruler is put in place, the colonizer, the ruler, it says, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord and walked. This is 1 Kings, chapter 15, verse 34. Now the ruler at this point is Jeroboam. He's over Israel. It says, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord and walked in the way of Jeroboam. And in his sin wherewith he made Israel to sin. Who made Israel to sin? Jeroboam. Why? How? Because he was the ruler. He was the king. So because he was the king and the ruler, he forced Israel to sin. They followed in the ways of Jeroboam. Jeroboam colonized the mind of Israel. And when he colonized the mind of Israel, then Israel worked amongst itself to create a perpetual state of colonization. Here are the elements of colonizing. One of the first things you do when you go to colonize, you got to force your religion on the people. You have to convince them to change their own religion. Because once you convince them to worship your God instead of worshiping their God, they got you. See, as long as man is worshiping his own God, according to historical, his religious understanding, as long as he's worshiping his own God, he's good. The minute you get him to go away from worshiping his God, he's no good. So when they went into the region, one of the first things that they did is that they changed the image of Jesus. They changed the image of Christ. They changed the understanding of Christ. They altered the doctrine to support the best interest of Constantine. That's why if you remember, Constantine had the vision in early 300s, 312, 320, in hoc signo vinces, with this sign we shall rule. Christianity was no longer Christianity, it became Christendom. Christianity is when the rules are controlled and set up by the Spirit of God. Christendom, which it became, is a governmental rule that hides behind the umbrella of Christianity, but the authority is based upon the best interests of the government, not the best interests of the Spirit of God. So Christianity became Christendom. And when it became Christendom, those things fell into place. Now, once he gets you religion, he changes your religion. He changes your understanding of God. And once he changes that, it's really all over. But then he goes a step further. With your changed religion, with your changed spiritual understanding, then he changes your language. He tells you that you can no longer speak your native tongue. That's why when you read any books about slavery, look at any movies related to slavery, one of the first things they do is they tell you you cannot communicate in your same language, in your native tongue. Then they separate the slaves that speak the same language so that there can be no form of communication. That right there is very powerful when it comes to colonization. But this is what has happened to our people and people across the world. So, language, religion, education. His whole education is centered around giving you a superior understanding of him and an inferior understanding of yourself. Colonization. And once he's established that point, then you will convince those around you through your uninformed, misinformed, misinterpreted education that colonization is necessary. This is what happened. But in understanding all of that, decolonization is the necessity of today. Because if we don't decolonize, we'll never come back to our proper understanding. How do you decolonize? By going back to your natural religion. By practicing your natural tongue. By going back to your natural education. Then on top of that, he gave us a diet that meant it's no good. We eat now the slave master's diet. We cook according to the needs of the slave master. We're not natural pig eaters. In the book of Deuteronomy chapter 14 verse 8, it tells us to stay away from the swine. Don't even touch it. But every morning at breakfast, we got bacon, pork sausage. We even eat pork guts. We eat the pig guts. Because that's the diet that we were put on. The pig feet, the pig ears. That's the diet that we were put on. But that is a colonizing diet. The diet is designed to be adverse to your natural existence. There is such a thing as negative foods. Pig is a negative food. Once the pig's flesh and blood gets in you, it causes your body to respond in a negative way. It alters your thinking in a negative way. And one of the fastest ways that it does it is through increasing your blood pressure. The worst form of cholesterol from any animal is the pig. And we intake that. All of these things are not good for us. So in order for us to decolonize, we got to give the colonizer his tools back. And once you start giving him his tools back, you're naturally decolonizing. But I tell you first, the first thing you got to give him back is his spiritual system. And now, I'm talking about self-colonization. But when we look into our church system, we see a broader form of colonization that is an incubator for producing colonizers. The church today is an incubator because they haven't removed themselves from his perspective of our God system. Look, as much as we think we know, we're practicing under the authority and leadership of our colonizer. We are not in our right minds yet. Because if we were in our right minds, we wouldn't be honoring his understanding of religion, language, diet, and education. We'd be doing our own, and we think we're doing our own, but we're not. So decolonization has to occur in a rampant and robust way in order for us to have self-determination as the spirit or driving force for self-colonization. But that won't happen until we decolonize first. We have to decolonize. Culture. Our cultures, we've become very much part of the culture of our oppression. And as long as we're practicing and doing things according to our oppressor, we'll never see beyond where we actually are. We'll become very much like the Indian, whose boundaries have been redefined. This is not the way we should be thinking from a narrow perspective. We should be thinking from a broad perspective. And I'll tell you again, it was the Land Act, 1626, and years in between, 1785, where the European was given free land, came over here to claim as much land as he wanted to. All he had to do was have it, build a 12 by 12 shelter on it, have it for 5 years, and deed goes right to him. His ownership, no money passed. So he gained wealth quick because of the land. And as you've heard me say in some of my other videos, when you go into some parts of the Midwest, there was gold on the land. So the free land now was converted into gold money. And he was making money off the gold. Now he can use that money he made off the gold to build bigger businesses, to buy more land, to exploit more people, to colonize more regions and territory. It was one of the biggest welfare systems the United States of America has ever known. It was the Land Act. And then the Farming Act that followed with that. Loaned them money for slaves. Loaned them money for equipment. We were never entitled to any of these things. So therefore our economic growth was a lot slower than the economic growth of the European. And it empowered the European in such a way that he became our colonizer. Look at what happened in Africa. At the Berlin Conference, it says Africa divide and banking. Just let me share a couple quick things with you and we're going to start wrapping up. See, decolonization is a must. We have to decolonize, and by decolonizing, you got to give the European all of his tools back. You see it in your religion, in your language, in your education, in your diet, in your culture. But look at the last one here, Africa divide. The Berlin Conference of 84. They divided up Africa into 54 countries. And the European nations took control. These lines that you see drawn here now, they were not always here. These lines that are here now were as a result of the Berlin Conference of 1884. When they divided up Africa amongst the European nations, deciding which nation would have what. France would have the West. Britain and the United States would split the East and the Central parts of it. These things were part of the colonizing process, where Africa was colonized and its natural resources were taken out of Africa. But not only did they start to colonize them through war, there came a different form of war that they put in Africa. They put viruses into Africa to destroy Africa medically. These things were happening. As a matter of fact, European countries had science labs on the continent developing viruses to destroy the local Africans. Ebola virus design. And they have different strands of it that they can put out whenever they want to. And they develop other viruses off of that. We see this as a part of the colonization. Look at what's happening with the French right now in Africa. With West African countries. 85% of all of their money has to be sent to France. 85% has to be sent to France. That means that if I make $100, $85 goes to France. African countries on the West are only allowed to keep 15% of their gross product. Only allowed to keep 15%. This is serious colonization. If they want more than 15%, they have to apply for it. But they can't get their own money back. It's in French banks. They have to apply for it through a loan. And then once they apply for it through a loan, they're charged commercial interest on the money. It's their money. But this is colonization at its worst. West Africa has to decolonize. There's no doubt about it. All of us have to decolonize. But the biggest threat to the global economy today is decolonization. But the biggest threat to the people today is colonization. Self-colonization is the biggest threat you can impose on any people. So what I'm saying today is that we have to find a way to decolonize. How do you decolonize? Work these elements. But first, give him his religion back. You got to give him his religion back. And I know the language thing may be a little bit complex, but at least his education, re-educate yourself on how you think. The diet, give him his diet back. Give him his culture back. Because all of it is causing you to become a perpetual state of colonizing. You're your own colonizer, your own worst enemy, as long as you're operating within his realm. There's nothing wrong with being an African. There's nothing wrong with that. It's your natural existence. Keep rolling. Exodus 1:19, look at the language. And the midwife said unto Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women. Now, the Egyptians are the conquerors at this point. The Bible says the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They're not like them. There's nothing wrong with being different, family. For they are lively and are delivered, the midwives come in unto them. They're delivering quickly, babies. Look, because we were different, we were forced to change our ways and our culture to mesh with our colonizer. We're not like them. There's nothing wrong with that, though. They're not like us. Why should we have to change our culture to adapt to their culture, their lifestyle? We shouldn't. And when you don't do that, you're decolonizing. You want to decolonize. 1 Peter 2:9. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into the marvelous light. The Bible is making it clear that we're different, but we're different because we're God's chosen people, period. Keep going. 1 Kings 12:28-30. Whereupon the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold and said unto them, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Behold thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. So what they're doing here in 1 Kings again is trying to convince the Egyptians to change their religion by serving their gods. They want them to worship idols. They want them to worship things that are not truly their gods, as in the image of this. You saw this firsthand. They changed your religion. And the scripture is reminding us right here again. Look at it. It says, whereupon the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold, wanting them to worship calves now instead of their natural God. Ezekiel 5:8-10. This is why decolonization is so important. Because we need to go back to worshiping God according to our ancestral lineage. Ezekiel 5:8-10. Therefore, this is what the master says. I'm setting myself against you. Remember, you're God's chosen people. But he's saying now, I'm setting myself against you. Yes, against you, Jerusalem. I'm going to punish you in full sight of the nations. That means every nation will see your punishment. Because of your disgusting no God idols. Because you're worshiping calves. You're worshiping idols. Because you're doing this, God is going to punish you. I'm going to do something to you that I've never done before and will never do again. Turn families into cannibals. Parents eating children, children eating parents. Punishment indeed. And whoever left over, I'll throw to the winds. Now, this is not literal talking about me eating my son. Or my son eating me. This is more so talking about us destroying each other. Me not being a good father to my son, which causes him to destruct. Him not being a good son to his father, which destroys me. We're eating each other from that perspective. You heard somebody even on a basketball court, oh man, he ate him up. It didn't mean he literally ate him up. He put a move on him that dropped him, that destroyed him. So when you say he ate him up, you're not talking about literally eating here. You're not talking about cannibalistic from the perspective that you're literally eating. You've heard people say, I'm so hungry I can eat a cow. You're not going to go eat a cow. But it's a figure of speech. These are parables that we're dealing with. So you hear some of the brothers talking about, oh man, Africans eating each other. Nah, brother, you need to take the time and learn the scripture. It's a figure of speech. It's a parable. It's not a literal sense here. Luke 2:9-12. And lo, the angel of the Lord came upon them, and the glory of the Lord shone round about them. And they were so afraid. And the angel said unto them, Fear not, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which shall be to all people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, which is Christ the Lord. And this shall be a sign unto you. Ye shall find the babe wrapped in swaddling clothes, lying in a manger. Why is this so important? Because here's what happened. Here's the beautiful thing that comes out of colonization. When you colonize a people, you always create leaders to overthrow the colonizer. When you colonize us, leaders are created within our own ranks to overthrow the colonizer. It's just a matter of time. But the time is up because we pulled the 400 years in prison. Now it's time for us to overthrow the colonizer. How do I mean? Jesus historically was on the scene to fight against the Roman Empire. And every time we have leaders that pop up, you can look at Elijah Muhammad, you can look at Malcolm X, you can look at Marcus Messiah Garvey, you can look at Martin Luther King, you can look at Noble Drew Ali, you can look at Harriet, you can look at Ida B. Wells, you can look at all of our great leaders. This is what happens when you colonize. You produce leaders that will overthrow the colonizer. But what I want you to understand that within you is the spirit to overthrow your own colony. Within you have the power to destroy those things that mean you no good, whatever they may be. You have that power right now. The only thing that's stopping you is you. Make the decision that you will not colonize yourself, period. And then move out according to that understanding. Hong Kong, getting there. Y'all know, anybody know what Hong Kong is? Right. Hong Kong is a natural part of China, geographically. Hong Kong was controlled by the Brits. Well, first it was controlled by China. Then during the Opium Wars of the 1840s, the British took control of China. Because British was trying to colonize China by bringing opium in China and getting people hooked on opium in China. So a part of colonizing is to hook the people on drugs as well. It's a part of colonizing. It's a typical system that's used by European colonizers when they come into your territory. They hook the people on drugs. They hook the Native Americans on alcohol. Look at what happened to our families. In the early 1900s, it was a heroin in our communities. Then in the 1970s and 80s, it was crack cocaine. Up into the 90s and 2000s, even still crack cocaine. These systems are used as war systems from the colonizer. So it was no different in 1841 when the British went into China and tried to get the Chinese hooked on opium so that they can get control of their precious seeds in their land. And they did gain control of Hong Kong in 1841, and the British controlled Hong Kong in 1841. The Japanese took control in 1941 to 1945. Then the British took control again from the Japanese and held on to it until 1997 when China gained control of it again. It was given back to China in 1997. But what I want you to understand is this. As a result of that, the Hongkonese became so indoctrinated. They became so indoctrinated with colonization that they still want today to be colonized. Let me show you what I mean. Now, what happens is this. China is trying to now move gradually back in, although they've been granted power in 1997 over Hong Kong again, which is a part of Chinese territory. Now, Hong Kong doesn't want to be ruled by China. They'd rather be ruled by the Brit if they're going to be ruled. Because they are already indoctrinated with the British understanding. the British ideology, the British culture. They speak English. So they've already been indoctrinated. They're saying they'd rather be ruled by the Brits than to be ruled by China. Okay. Now, self-governance and self-determination is the way to go. Now, look at this. This is Hong Kong. They're pleading and begging the United States to intervene and take control. Look at them flying the flags. Get that, sir, if you haven't already. This is Hong Kong. This is recent. Because you know now that they're in an uproar over there. They're rioting. They're protesting. Here's a British flag. This is Hong Kong. Very developed nation. So is Taiwan. Very developed nations. Look at this right here. Now, people are dying in Hong Kong, and the police are not claiming it, but the police are killing people. Then other people are killing people. Stop the killing. It's like a black community in the U.S., except they're Chinese or Hunganese. This is what they are. But it looks like people protesting in the black community. Get that? You got it? Okay, good. It looks like people protesting in the black community. Stop the killing. I can't breathe. This is what happens when your colonizer is there. But your colonizer, once he becomes so indoctrinated, self-colonization occurs. This is self-colonization right here. Self-colonization. Pleading. Asking America to intervene. Look at this. This is Hong Kong. President Trump, please liberate Hong Kong. See, you got to understand this. The Chinese government has already made it known that he knows who's behind the protests. He's made it known that government cells that are in Hong Kong are responsible for exacerbating the tension between the Hunganese and the Chinese. That these government cells are the ones that are behind the protesting. Infiltrators. And now they're saying, President Trump, please liberate Hong Kong. This is what happens when you're colonized. Even when your colonizer is no longer there, he's still controlling. Matthew 22 through 20. 20 through 22. And he saith unto them, whose is this image and subscription? They say unto him, Caesar's. Then saith he unto them, render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. You got to make a decision. Either you're going to be colonized or you're not. But if you want to be under the authority of God, then self-colonization is very important from that perspective. Decolonization is a necessity. You have to decolonize. You can no longer parade and walk under the authority of your oppressor because you see what has gotten you. So you have to separate your mindset. Decolonization. Separate from the colony. You have to separate from the colony by giving the elements back to the colonizer. And practice proper self-colonization. Exodus 9. God said unto Moses, go to Pharaoh and tell him, God, the God of the Hebrews says, release my people so they can worship me. Here we go again. You got to separate. You got to part. If you refuse to release them and continue to hold to them, I'm giving you fair warning. God is warning those that hold on to Israel what's going to happen if you do. Great calamities will continue to come. Great destruction, whirlwinds, tornadoes, you name it. Your livestock will be dying first. He's going to strike them with diseases. We see this story biblically, but this is the time where it's applicable. You're going to see these things being applied right here, right now. Just keep your ears open. Zechariah 12 and 9. And it shall come to pass. Now go back here. God is warning Pharaoh to release his people. Who's God's chosen people? We are, right? He's wanting to release them. I'm giving you fair warning. Now watch this. And it shall come to pass in that day that I will seek to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem or that come against Israel. Everybody that comes against Israel, God has your number. And you won't get away. Plain and simple. If you don't believe it, keep living. Look at this. We talked about this earlier. America has 2.3 prisoners. 2.3 million prisoners right now. The majority of them per capita look like us. We make up 40% of the prison system, although we only 13% of America's population. To put it in perspective, another way, let's put it another way to make it more visible. What percentage of black people in America? 13%. And we make up 40% of the prison population, right? You would think the larger percentage will make up more of the prison population. The Europeans make up 64% of America's population, and they make up 39% of the prison population. When you look at it per capita, our numbers are through the roof. With 13% of the population and 40% of the prison. Europeans are 64% of the population and 39% of the prison. America has the largest prison population in the world. There's about 320 million Americans. There's 1.3 million Chinese. China has about 3.5 times our population, but not as many prisoners as we have. Look at the data. It says the United States has 2.1, this is 2.3 really, million prisoners. China has 1.3 million people and 1.5 million inmates. America has only 320 million people, not a billion, 320 million people, and have 2.9 million inmates. China has 1.3 billion people, 1.3, and only have 1.5 million incarcerated. Our rate is through the roof. That just shows you the heavy colonizing is happening in the United States of America, but more specifically amongst black people. Zechariah 9:11. Check it out. And you, because of my blood, covenant with you. I release your prisoners from their hopeless cells. All this is happening, man. Come home, hope-filled prisoners. This very day, I'm declaring a double bonus. Everything you lost, return over. Judah is now my weapon and bow. I'll pull, setting Ephraim as an arrow to the string. We're dealing, say it, with a large percentage of inmates. Judah is incarcerated. She's in prison. And the largest percentage of her people incarcerated are in the United States of America. This is what the scripture is trying to tell us. It says, Judah is now my weapon. The bow I'll pull, setting Ephraim as an arrow to the string. I'll wake up your sons, O Zion, to counter your sons, O Greece. It's telling us that Zion will counter Greece. From now on, people are my swords. Then God will come into view. His arrows flashing like lightning. Matched to God will blast his trumpet and set out in a whirlwind. God of the angel armies will protect them. All out war. The war to end all wars. No holds barred. Their God will save the day. He'll rescue them. They become like sheep, gentle and soft, or like gemstones in a crown, catching the colors of the sun. Then how they shine, shimmer, glow. Catching the colors of the sun. How can you catch the colors of the sun? Huh? You absorb the light. And what do you have to do to absorb the sunlight? What does your body have to do? Melanin. Right. Melanin. This is what the scripture is telling us. Exodus 4:23. God said, Moses, when you go back to Egypt, be prepared. All the wonders that I will do through you, you'll do before Pharaoh. But I will make him stubborn so that he'll refuse to let the people go. Then you are to tell Pharaoh God's message. Israel is my son, my firstborn. I told you Free my son so that he can serve me, but you refuse to free him. So now I'm going to kill your son. Dudes, this is just where we are. This is not my doing. Kill your firstborn. This is what's getting ready to happen. And this is nothing that we're making up. We're going by the scripture. There's a price that has to be paid for colonizing the people like Pharaoh's done. Summarizing. What I wanted you to see today is that how we've been colonized. But I also wanted you to see that the worst colonizer is you. We have the power and the control and the authority to no longer colonize us and our communities. And we need to start moving out according to that. Decolonization has to occur. Because if we don't decolonize, we continue to perpetuate these crimes against ourselves and against our communities. Thank you all for tuning in. Any questions? All right, thank you. Thank you. May the blessing of the Most High continue to rest upon you.